Yo guys, we are reacting again, and this time is False Knight a bad first boss? Let's go.
False Knight doesn't have to be the first boss you fight. There is Grossmother and even Brooding Moloch, but Grossmother is arguably a mini-boss, and few beginners will be able to reach Moloch, so for all intents and purposes, your first proper boss encounter will be False Knight. My brother quit the game after meeting him and has never since returned, so let's find out how well he actually does as Hollow Knight's first major encounter. I'm Holland, and this is Behind the Boss.
Just wanna say, if someone quits before beating False Knight, I highly doubt it's a skill issue.
I want to start this analysis off by talking briefly about how games teach the player. When a game wants to introduce a new mechanic, it usually starts by presenting a simplified version of that mechanic to the player. For example, if you want to show that platforming will be part of your game, you might start by forcing the player to do a simple jump. Next, you add a few more jumps that have to be completed in succession. Failure results in having to start over from scratch. Once you think the player has grasped the basics of platforming, you can swap out the floor with spikes to raise the stakes. Keep presenting the player with harder and harder platforming challenges, and you've got yourself a difficulty curve. Slowly introducing players to a core mechanic is common practice in practically every video game. However, this easing process is a delicate balance. You don't want to hold the player's hand too much, or you might kill the flow of gameplay, stunt any feelings of accomplishment, or make the game tedious on future playthroughs. You also don't want to ramp up the difficulty too quickly, or you risk not teaching every player properly and losing some to frustration. There are multiple ways to thread this needle. First, you might teach the player a mechanic in secret. Hollow Knight could have taught you that some walls are breakable with a pop-up. However, that breaks flow and might feel too hand-holdy. Instead, they opted for this. The designers have already taught us that we want the geo that is stored in these rocks. Then, by placing a rock next to this breakable wall, you get this accidental revelation of having broken the wall by yourself, yet it was really a trick all along. The game taught you a lesson in secret. Secondly, you can steadily introduce a more complex feature, say the moves of a boss fight, one element at a time. These brutes not only warn the player that white shockwaves running along the floor must be avoided, but also that some enemies try to damage you with a charged weapon swing. Up until now, most enemies have only been dealing contact damage. No doubt the encounter of this brute specifically is an attempt to teach the player some part of the False Knight's moveset before you reach his chamber.
And also, to help you get used to the controls, to help you get used to moving, jumping, not only mechanically, but also just, making it more fluid for you. And you do that through easy early bosses.
There are many such tiny lessons taught to you throughout your time with Hollow Knight. Some of them are so subtle that you might not even realize they're lessons, bleeding into the previous point about teaching in secret. This breakable door checks that you know how to use your nail before reaching the first enemy. Notice the lack of such barricades later in the game, they're not a proper game mechanic. The instance of this floor collapsing below you warns you that such things might happen later in the game. This battle arena locks you in until you defeat all of the enemies, teaching you that running away is not always an option. These husks are a way of
Not really. When you fight in arenas like that, it's just something that's very, very popular in Metroidvanias. It doesn't teach you that running away anything. It's just a challenge, a local challenge in the game.
showing that enemies may jump at you, preparing you for False Knight's repositioning move, and so on. Teaching a mechanic in secret or in smaller bits are two ways of avoiding having to use a pop-up screen as a guide. They help beginners understand how to interact with the game with as little interruption to gameplay as possible. But what if you have to slow down the pace to teach beginners a lesson? How do you avoid lessening the experience for those who have already played before? Well, you give the experienced player something optional to do while the beginner struggles with the base challenge. Think of a simple enemy encounter in hallways that can be ignored by a skilled player. Or, and this relates back to the topic at hand, think of the falling rocks from False Knight.
But why do we need to give an experienced player an alternative route when they can play the game again, have fun with being strong against easy bosses? It's part of the experience.
Finally, we're talking about the actual boss. See, I don't believe that False Knight is too easy for new players. As I told you in the intro, my brother quit the game because he couldn't beat it. But it still had the potential to be really boring for those replaying the game.
By the way, notice that in the fight with False Knight you have 5 masks. 5. Which is a lot. A lot. 5 masks are enough to fight this easy and slow boss. So quitting at False Knight, I doubt it.
Beat it. But it still had the potential to be really boring for those replaying the game. False Knight attacks painfully slowly compared to every other boss in the game, and having to wait for him to finish his gravity-defying jump or rage-induced hammer rampage would have made for a boring and uninteractive experience for Hollow Knight veterans. Thankfully, during the fight against False Knight, there is no mandatory downtime. Although this can't be said for every boss in the game, it's clear that Team Cherry prioritized making False Knight in particular a fun encounter for all skill levels. Let me explain. While False Knight is doing his sluggish repositioning move, you can jump up and strike him from below. It can be quite a tricky thing to pull off even if you are experienced at the game, but it's great to have that option if you don't feel like waiting around. And when the boss is on his hammer slam rampage, you can redirect the falling rocks to deal damage to him even while he's almost unapproachable for melee strikes. You might think this has nothing to do with the topic at hand, whether False Knight fails or succeeds as a first boss, but it does in a sense. Because if Team Cherry had wanted the most beginner-friendly experience as possible, they should have made False Knight far easier. They didn't need to add the ability to hit the falling rocks back at him. Heck, they could have added 5 similar boss encounters, one after the other, each one slightly harder than the previous, to
The Great Knights of Handholding. Yes. Good idea.
hold the player's hand the entire way. And this would have sacrificed any fun you could have had as a returning player, or even just as someone moderately experienced at video games.
Yep.
You would be spending an hour fighting bosses that were way below your skill level just to get to the fun part. What makes a good introductory fight isn't just how well it works as a teacher, but how much it lessens the experience for anyone who doesn't need to be taught. Let's then finally move on to the main man himself. False Knight is exactly that, a false knight, because he's nothing more than a maggot wearing a stolen suit of armor. This magnificent suit once belonged to a mighty warrior by the name of Hegemold, one of the 5 great knights of Hallownest. Hegemold himself is long gone, however, and all that's left of him is a statue outside the city of Tears, as well as the False Knight. Venturing through the Forgotten Crossroads, you soon enter a large chamber. Fighting off some infected bugs, you're suddenly ambushed by a bulking monstrosity. Not ready for the surprise, and with no knowledge of his moveset, it's not long before you reach critically low health. Running to the edge of the arena in a desperate plea for momentary respite, you realize too late that you're out of soul for healing. You may or may not have noticed this, but the only way to gain soul during the fight against False Knight is by hitting him while he's staggered. I've heard only one guess as to why this is the case, and I think it makes a lot of sense. The game is trying to teach you to dodge attacks rather than relying on tanking them and healing up afterwards.
Also, canonically, you're hitting his armor and not the enemy itself. And we only gain soul from hitting enemies, so it does make sense.
Forcing you into soul deprivation keeps you from excessively using focus. The rest of what False Knight tries to teach the player revolves around the standard boss formula, a set of actions and behaviors you should expect from future bosses. They include telegraphs. False Knight has some of the slowest and most obvious telegraphs in the game. He's teaching you to watch the boss closely for indications of what his next move might be. Repositioning moves. False Knight jumps very slowly across the arena, preparing us for the future repositioning hell that is bosses like Hornet and Broken Vessel. Staggers. False Knight's stagger visually screams at you to hit him while he's down. You can also sneak in a heal or two before re-engaging. Phases. False Knight's 2 distinct phases prepares you for the possibility that any boss might change moveset throughout a fight. I'm sure there are more examples, but I think you get the point. False Knight is a laughably simple fight in comparison to nearly every other major encounter in the game. But that's because we forget how little we knew about the mechanics of Hollow Knight the first time we faced him.
No, I don't agree. False Knight is not only easy compared to other bosses in the game, False Knight is easy compared to bosses in other games. False Knight is a very easy encounter overall, not only compared to the bosses in the game. And even if you don't have the mechanics, you don't have the dash, you don't have D-Dark, you don't have Shriek, you don't have Fireball, and you only have your jump, it still is a very easy fight, regardless.
He has to be simple, or newer players would quit, just like my brother did when he fought False Knight.
I don't think people quit because False Knight is not easy enough or because they have skill issue. Not when getting to False Knight. Because he's so slow and he's so easy and you have 5 HP. There's a higher chance that either you just don't like the game and the first slight challenge is a good excuse for you to leave. That makes sense. Or you have a serious problem with the controls. But I don't think it's a skill issue and I don't think it's the boss being not that easy or not easy enough.
So let's talk about that. Why did my brother quit? Isn't that an indication that False Knight fails as a first boss? Well, no, I don't think it is. It's hardly controversial to suggest that Hollow Knight is a pretty difficult game. Perhaps getting the regular ending isn't out of reach for most people, but even that requires a moderate degree of motoric finesse, determination, and proficiency in pattern recognition. And while that makes the game a special type of hard that I'm absolutely in love with, it also does mean that if you can't beat False Knight, it's probably not a game for you. That's not to say I beat False Knight on my first attempt, nor is it to mock my little brother for quitting the game. He's actually far more skilled than I am at most games.
So it's not a skill issue.
It's to say that, for the difficulty Hollow Knight tries to achieve, False Knight acts as a necessary gatekeeper. And if you can't beat him on your 15th attempt, maybe that's not an indication that he's poorly designed. Maybe, just maybe, it's an indication that you should play something else.
No. If you didn't beat False Knight after 15 attempts, it doesn't mean anything. You can still beat him at your 25 or 50 attempt. It's not the issue at all. The issue is, do you feel this boss is way too hard for you? Then something is wrong.
I'm a pretty critical person by nature, so I've surprised even myself by getting this far more or less on pure optimism. That said, if we can briefly shift our attention to Failed Champion, I'll have a lot more harsh things to say. Failed Champion is the dream version of False Knight, and while the problems I have with him also ring true for the original, they are way more pronounced with Failed Champion. This is mostly due to the increased difficulty of that fight. Making a harder version of a boss is actually a pretty good way to test whether it's fairly designed or not. In my analysis of the Soul Master, I noted how both the original and the dream version of that boss are wonderful fights, and that's a testament to how fair the Soul Master's moveset is. False Champion, on the other hand, doesn't fare quite as well when scaled up in difficulty. This is primarily due to 3 factors. Firstly, while the False Knight encounter doesn't feel like it relies that much on randomness, that's because it's masked by the low difficulty. Once you go up against Failed Champion, especially on Radiant, the extent to which RNG determines the difficulty of the fight becomes way more pronounced. Flaming rocks, or barrels apparently, now fall from the ceiling every time the boss strikes the ground with his hammer or his body. If any of those 2 actions are followed up with a shockwave slam, where the barrels fall can suddenly have a huge impact on how hard the shockwave is to avoid. Now, while that's somewhat tolerable, it baffles me that the number of shockwaves sent out is also left up to RNG. Failed Champion can do 1 to 3 shockwave slams in a row, and I don't believe there's a way to tell how many he's gonna do. Not only is jumping over a shockwave by far the hardest maneuver you have to do in this fight, but also just the fact that he might only do 1 slam and then immediately jump at you can be so frustrating to deal with.
Being cautious and spacing well against Failed Champion is the key to beating him. It's not about recognizing when he's gonna do a shockwave. It's not about only pattern recognition. There's a lot of spacing in this game, and that's the major point of beating Failed Champion. I will link my fight of beating Failed Champion on Radiant without charms, and you will see that I'm not using any soul exploits or anything unique. I do use nail arts, which is something that's very underutilized for many Hollow Knight gamers.
So those are the main randomness factors: where the flaming barrels spawn, how frequently the boss uses his shockwave strike, and how many shockwaves he decides to send out. Secondly, while I was writing this script, I was wondering why I didn't know exactly what the telegraph was for performing a shockwave strike. I was almost certain there was one, but I couldn't tell you what it was. Now, after having gone up against Failed Champion a few more dozen times, I believe the fight is bugged. As far as I can tell, you're supposed to know that the boss is gonna send out a shockwave because he does a little backwards jump first, giving you room to dodge the attack if he had you pinned up against the wall. This is a good telegraph that's really quite expertly implemented, because you need to be able to tell the difference between a regular slam and a shockwave slam.
Not necessarily, again, you need to have proper spacing regardless of is it a shockwave slam or is it not.
The problem is that very rarely, Failed Champion will jump forwards, land, and then do a shockwave slam. It's like he thinks you're behind him and tries to get away from you by jumping towards you. Either this is a bug, which I think it likely is, or it's an inexcusably bad feature. The last problem I have with the encounter is my well-known repositioning critique. When False Knight or Failed Champion wants to move, he has a very brief wind-up animation before launching into the air. He can then either do a tiny jump or a huge leap, and not only is the telegraph so short that you can't possibly react to it if you're already mid-air, but you also have no way of knowing where he's gonna jump to. Once again, it's not a big issue for the painfully sluggish False Knight, but for Radiant Failed Champion, it makes me want to rip my hair out sometimes.
I mean, that's the whole concept of spacing, again.
The final thing I want to talk about isn't really a piece of criticism, although I would probably like to see a change here too. There's an exploit you can do against False Knight and Failed Champion if you have the Dream Nail that allows you to safely collect infinite soul from the boss. Long story short, if you hit the knight's body periodically, he won't get up because the game thinks you're dealing damage to him and thus progressing the fight. Meanwhile, you can safely collect soul using the Dream Nail, hitting his body, not his head, after each Dream Nail to prolong the stagger. It's not to be a buzzkill I want this exploit fixed, I actually think it's pretty cool, but because it's so powerful, you're kind of forced into using it if you don't want to handicap yourself.
It is very powerful because you gain a lot of soul, but you really don't need to do that. And again, I will link my Failed Champ fight in the description below, and I'll show you that you don't need to do that at all to win the fight.
And, well, it becomes a chore after a while, especially when attempting Failed Champion on Radiant. But more than anything, I just wanted to mention the exploit because I thought it was cool. I know I just spent the last few paragraphs tearing Failed Champion apart, but I wanna say, I do like the fight. It's by no means the worst in the game. I just wish it wasn't so reliant on RNG. Let's bring this back to False Knight. Funnily enough, I don't think the fight's reliance on RNG impacts him very much at all. He's too slow to really capitalize on how random his attacks can be. Perhaps my brother will someday return and finish what he started, but whatever his reasons were for quitting prematurely, I wouldn't blame them on False Knight. Because all things considered, I think this brave little maggot does a wonderful job as Hollow Knight's first boss.
Let's go!
So we overall agree that it's not False Knight's fault that his brother left the game after encountering False Knight. And overall I think False Knight is okay as an early boss. He's not too hard. He's not incredibly easy. And it teaches you the basics of the fight. It teaches you the basics of the controls. And overall does a great job.
Thank you so much for watching. Feel free to let me know down in the comments if you disagreed with any of my opinions, and if you want to, I'm open for suggestions on what boss I should cover next. Have a wonderful day. Bye!
Okay, so like before, this creator makes really good Hollow Knight videos. So please subscribe, comment, like, support this creator. I like him. I like Holland. I hope you guys enjoyed this reaction video. We'll do more in the future. If you guys have suggestions, write them in the comments and I will see to it. Bye for now.